بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وبعد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Welcome once again to another session with Imam al-Wasiti and his treatise. This is Risala. What is this? مفتاح الطريق إلى سلوك التحقيق. Okay, it's kind of like what we're calling the path key to the journey of spiritual realization. And we're now starting another chapter. We're going to jump right into it where the Imam he says وَيُرَاعِي أَحْكَامَ الصَّلَوَاتِ الْخَمْسِ فَلَا يُصَلِّي صَلَاةَ الْعُمُومِ وَلْيَتَعَوَّدْ أَنْ يُصَلِّيَ الْفَرَائِضَ صَلَاةَ الْخُصُوصِ. So he observes the rules of the 5 daily prayers, meaning وَيُرَاعِي, and he observes. So after all the things we talked about muhasaba, we talked about muraqaba, being accountable, being vigilant, etc., those various things. Now after that, we're going to observe the rules of the 5 daily prayers, starting with this as the first action, if you will, because this is going to be the first thing we're asked about in terms of our deeds on the day of resurrection. Not performing the prayer of the masses. This is Salat al-Umum, the prayer of the masses, but trains himself to perform the prayer of the elite. Notice there's a distinction here, and there's various stages in between the prayer of the masses versus the prayer of the elites, okay? And we're going to look at some of those in greater detail shortly. So the author is emphasizing to us a mindset shift when it comes to approaching obligatory prayers, encouraging us to move from performing them as routine acts, habits that we have, like mechanics of it, where we just are worried about doing the actions and saying the words, moving from that to offering them with a profound level of sincerity and a true depth of mindfulness. And to do that, right, one might already understand, like, yeah, I know my prayers need to be very special. They shouldn't just be habitual actions, but special. How do I go about doing that? And so he highlights a number of factors, contributing factors to achieve such a state. He says, مثلا إذا سمع النداء بالصلاة فليعلم أنه داعي الله داعي الله. قال الله تعالى استجيبوا لله وللرسول إذا دعاكم لما يحييكم. He says here, for example, when he hears the adhan, he must realize that it is the call of Allah. Da'i Allah. This is the call of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah exalted be, he says, respond to Allah. This is a verse from the Quran. Istajibu lillahi wa lirrasul. Respond to Allah and to the messenger when he calls you to that which gives you life. So the call here of prayer, when you hear that, it should be seen as if you're responding to a personal call from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That Allah is calling you. And this, of course, is rooted in the verse that he recites, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu stajibu lillahi walirrasul idha da'akum lima yuhyikum. O you who have believed, respond to Allah. And here you're responding to Allah's call to prayer. Respond to Allah. If you are a person of faith, then this call is for you. So the mindset shift here begins where the believer views the adhan as a personal invitation to, as described in the verse, lima yuhyikum, a life-giving encounter. And this will set the tone for the prayer to begin the transformation process from being a mechanical activity to a very spiritual endeavor. We want it to become a spiritual event for us. Something that, I say the word event because typically we get excited about and look forward to events. He says, فَيَنْوِي بِرَوَاحِهِ إِلَى الْمَشْتَدِ دَاعِيَ اللَّهِ فَلْيَجْعَلْ نَفْسَهُ كَأَنَّهُ يَزُورُ اللَّهَ تَعَالَى فِي بَيْتِهِ وَحَقٌّ عَلَى الْمَزُورِ and yukrim al-za'ir. And yukrim al-za'ir. He says, he then intends, as he sets out to the masjid, the call of Allah, meaning he's intending to answer that call. He then must perceive himself as though he is visiting Allah. Okay, so you got the invitation, and now you're going to visit. Visiting Allah, exalted is He, in His house, knowing that it is a duty upon the one visited to honor the visitor. So you're the visitor, going to visit Allah in His house. And so one of the motivating factor is you recognize the right of being honored by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the invitation to Allah's house, in which you're honored by the host, is further supported by a hadith in which the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he says, Inna lillahi buyutan fil ardi wa hiya al masajid. This is narrated by Imam al-Tabarani. Allah has houses on earth, and the masajid are His houses. Wa haqqun ala Allahi an yukrima man zarahu fiha. It's incumbent upon Allah to honor those who visit Him in His houses. So again, this is a mindset shift. It's perspective shift. Beginning with the adhan and the subsequent heading to the masjid. The call is made, you're answering the call, you're now making your way to the masjid with the intention of visiting Allah in His house. And so this is where the experience of prayer begins to elevate. And the process continues as he says, فَإِذَا دَخَلَ الْمَسْجِدَ فَلْيَسْتَشْعِرْ أَنَّهُ بَيْتُ اللَّهِ فإذا وقف في المحراب فليعلم أنه واقف بين يدي الله تعالى وأن الله تعالى مطلع عليه ناظر إليه يسمع نجواه ويعلم ما في ضميره فإذا قال الله أكبر فلا يكون في قلبه أكبر من الله. He says here, when he enters the masjid, he must feel that it is the house of Allah. When he stands in the prayer niche, the mihrab, he must realize that he is standing before Allah, exalted is He, and that Allah, exalted is He, is aware of him, keeping watch over him, hearing his secret whispers, and knowing his innermost thoughts. When he says Allahu Akbar, there should be nothing in his heart greater than Allah. Okay, so when we enter the masjid, to have the maximum impact on our prayers, we have to recognize the unique status of the place we've entered, being the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? And the Prophet ﷺ has taught us this unique status. There are numerous hadith talking about the virtue and status of the masjid. One of those, he says, Al-masajidu buyutullahi fil ardi tudhi'u li ahli as-sama'i kama tudhi'u nujumu as-sama'i li ahli al-ard. He says the masajid are the houses of Allah on earth. They illuminate تُضِيءُ لِأَهْلِ السَّمَاءِ, for the dwellers of the heavens, just as the stars of the heavens illuminate for the dwellers of the earth. So basically the masajid, being the houses of Allah, serve as beacons, guiding the wayward to Allah. And when one is there, they must absolutely feel as though they're standing before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this was also expressed by the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam. There's a hadith reported in Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, in which the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam saw that there was some spit on the wall of the Qibla, and he went and he scraped it off. And then he turned to the people and he said, إِذَا كَانَ أَحَدُكُمْ يُصَلِّي فَلَا يَبْسُقُ قِبَلَ وَجْهِهِ. That if one of you were to pray, go ahead. If one of you were to pray, let them not spit in front of him. فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ قِبَلَ وَجْهِهِ إِذَا صَلَّى. For Allah is in front of him when he prays. Again, Sahih Bukhari, Muslim. So the hadith here, there's a couple of things just to mention a few of the lessons found in this, it alludes to the masajid as places that have specific manners and etiquette. Okay? It's not like you're out on the street. Okay? It's not a common place. You're out in the park, you're out on the street, you're out about town. It's not like that. It's a very special place with particular manners and etiquettes. And the idea also from this hadith is that, as we can see from the end, you're standing before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there are numerous hadith with a similar meaning. Another one says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُكُمْ بِالصَّلَاةِ فِإِذَا صَلَّيْتُمْ فَلَا تَلْتَفِتُوا فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ يَنْصِبُ وَجْهَهُ لِوَجْهِ عَبْدِهِ فِي صَلَاتِهِ مَا لَمْ يَلْتَفِتْ. This is from Sunnah Tirmidhi. Indeed, Allah commands you to pray, so when you pray, do not turn away. فَلَا تَلْتَفِتُوا. Do not turn away, meaning turn your face, or to turn your attention, for Allah sets His wedge toward the face of His servant during the prayer as long as he does not turn away. Again, there are numerous hadith that address this topic, helping us feel and understand that we're standing before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so it emphasizes a high degree of attentiveness that we should have while we're in prayer, while we're standing in prayer. And to support the attentiveness that we should have, the author reminds us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware of what it is that we're doing and what it is that we're thinking. As he says, the secret words, al-najwa, which is like an intimate conversation you have privately between two, and what's happening fi dhamirihi. He says in his innermost thoughts, like his subconscious. The Prophet ﷺ says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَنْظُرُ إِلَى صُوَرِكُمْ وَأَمْوَالِكُمْ, that Allah does not look at or does not examine your appearances or your wealth. وَلَكَنْ يَنْظُرُ إِلَى قُلُوبِكُمْ وَأَعْمَالِكُمْ, but He examines your hearts and your deeds. Not only does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala know and is aware and examining how you're praying physically, what it is that you're doing to fulfill the basic mechanics, the obligations, the pillars, etc. of prayer, but also if your heart is present in prayer. If your heart, if the body is a reflection of the heart, or there's something missing there. So the heart must absolutely be present during your prayer, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees what is within it, and that of course is an integral part of it. And to aid that, right, we continue, he's continuing to add support and aids by understanding the nature of the prayer, from the adhan to going to entering to the masjid, etc. He says, فَإِذَا شَرَعَ فِي الْقِرَاءَةِ فَلْيَجْعَلْ مَعَانِيَ الْقِرَاءَةِ عِوَضًا عَنْ حَدِيثِ النَّفْسِ فَلَا يُحَدِّثُ نَفْسَهُ بِغَيْرِ مَا يَتْلُو وَمَتَى فَعَلَ ذَلِكَ كَانَ مَثَلُهُ كَمَثَلِ رَجُلٍ يَقُولُ بِلِسَانِهِ شَيْئًا وَيُحَدِّثُ بِقَلْبِهِ شَيْئًا آخَرَ وَذَلِكَ نَقْصٌ فِي الصَّلَوَاتِ وَعَيْبٌ فِي حَضْرَةِ الْحَقِّ وَلَكِنْ يَجْعَلُ النَّاطِقَ هُوَ الْقَلْبِ. Because when he begins the recitation, he must replace any inner dialogue with the meanings of the recitation. He must not address his nafs with anything other than what he is reciting. If he does, here in this case, meaning if he is holding an inner dialogue besides what he's reciting, like, those thoughts, we start thinking, what am I going to do? What am I going to eat? Where am I going to go? Where did I leave my wallet? What did my wife just say to me 5 minutes ago? Now, we start having this whole inner dialogue. Then he says he's like a man who says something with his tongue while his heart says something else. And this is a deficiency in the prayer and a flaw in the presence of the truth, al-haq, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Instead, he should make the heart the one speaking. So with the start of the prayer, we have to be mindful that we've entered into a private dialogue with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is something that you should imagine as you begin praying. And just like any other private conversation, it's rude to be distracted in mid-conversation. Right? Especially someone important to you. Think about a conversation with a superior, and all of a sudden you're distracted and you're drifting off, and oh, sorry, what did you just say? It's rude, it's a flaw, it's aib, it's a shame. The Prophet ﷺ says, "Inna ahadukum idha qama yusalli innama yunaji rabbahu, falyanzur kayfa yunaji." Right, this is related by Imam As-Suyuti in Al-Jami' As-Saghir. He says, indeed, the Prophet ﷺ says, indeed, when one of you stands to pray, he is conversing with his Lord. So consider how you're conversing with him. Consider the manner in which your conversation unfolds. This means that the heart must be present with the tongue and body acting as mere reflections of what the heart is saying and doing. There must be an alignment. There must be an alignment. You cannot be doing two things at one time, by the way. Thinking about this while you're doing that. The heart cannot focus on more than one thing at a time. مَا جَعَلَ اللَّهُ لِرَجُلٍ مِّن قَلْبَيْنِ فِي جَوْفِهِ. As Allah says in Surah Al-Ahzab, Allah has not made for man two hearts within him. There's not two hearts in one chest, such that you can now concentrate and be sincere in two different areas. The verse here reminds us that we can only focus on one thing at a time. And while we're in prayer, the focus must be on Allah alone. The Prophet ﷺ emphasized this in terms of the loss of reward that one would sustain when they're distracted in prayer. He says, "Inna rajula la yansarifu wa ma kutiba lahu illa ushru salatihi tus'uha thumunuha subu'uha sudusuha khumusuha rubu'uha thuluthuha nisfuha." This hadith says a man returns, and he means returning after his prayer, while a tenth, listen, while a tenth of his prayer, or a ninth part, or an eighth part, or a seventh part, or a sixth part, or a fifth part, or a third part, or a half of it is recorded for him. A tenth. You got something on the board. It may be that there's nothing, because there are cases that have been reported in which the person was informed that the Prophet ﷺ informed that there was nothing recorded for them at all, meaning it wasn't accepted. Right? So here, a person should pray with that alignment. That's what it's talking about. The point of the hadith, meaning that there's various degrees of people, and that, of course, in their prayer and their reward, and that depends on a number of factors, like the humility in prayer, their concentration, their reflection, these types of elements that signify completeness in prayer. Also, the mechanical parts are very important as well. How you're praying, what it is that you're doing. All of it goes together, hand in hand. So the hadith here is emphasizing this strong encouragement to be present in prayer, aligning the outside with the inside, and doing this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the author, he goes on and he says, فَإِذَا قَالَ الْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ الرَّحْمَنِ الرَّحِيمِ فَلْيَجْعَلِ النَّاطِقَ هُوَ الْقَلْبَ وَيَجْعَلْ لِسَانَ تَرْجُمَانًا يُتَرْجِمُ عَمَّا نَطَقَ الْقَلْبُ بِهِ. He says, thus when he says, الْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ الرَّحْمَنِ الرَّحِيمِ, we recognize this from Al-Fatiha. This is the beginning of the prayer. He should make the heart the one speaking, with the tongue serving as an interpreter, articulating what the heart has uttered. It should emanate from the heart. The tongue and the heart, they are in alignment. And when this happens, the worshiper achieves true sincerity. This is ikhlas in your prayer. The tongue becomes the interpreter of the heart's devotion. So, he gives us this example. When we say Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, the heart must reflect gratitude and submission to Allah while the tongue expresses that. And this is the harmony that embodies the harmony with the inside and outside, the inner and outer, that embodies the essence of what many of us know as khushu', having humility or submissiveness or surrender in prayer. And then the author demonstrates or illustrates for us various different stages of development by providing examples of people in prayer or categories of people. He says, وَالنَّاسُ فِي الصَّلَاةِ أَرْبَعَةُ أَصْنَافٍ مِنْهُمْ مَنْ يُصَلِّي بِظَاهِرِهِ وَيَقُولُ بِلِسَانِهِ وَقَلْبُهُ يَتَحَدَّثُ بِغَيْرِ مَا يُنَاجِي بِهِ رَبَّهُ بِلِسَانِهِ وَهَذِهِ صَلَاةُ الْغَافِلِينَ. So people fall into four categories with respect to prayer. Among them are those who pray outwardly and speak with their tongues, but their hearts are occupied, meaning they're doing all the outward actions, they're fulfilling all of those things. We got that on lock, no problem. But their hearts are occupied with something other than the conversation they're having with their Lord, and this is the prayer of the heedless. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warns of this. فَوَيْلٌ لِلْمُصَلِّينَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنْ صَلَاتِهِمْ سَاهُونَ. So woe to those who pray, who are heedless of their prayer. We know this from Al-Ma'un. This is verses number 4 and 5. Okay, so here, this particular verse, Ibn Kathir narrates from Ata ibn Dinar. He said, all praise is due to Allah, who said, those who are heedless of their prayer. الَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنْ صَلَاتِهِمْ سَاهُونَ, and did not say, فِي صَلَاتِهِمْ سَاهُونَ. Because عَنْ صَلَاتِهِمْ, it encompasses more in terms of meaning. All right? So the distinction here highlights different forms of negligence. And one of those, or let's say out of three, Ibn Kathir mentions delaying the prayer, neglecting proper performance of the prayer, like a person that delays prayer to its end all the time. Often they run into the disliked times of prayer. And then maybe neglecting proper performance of prayer. They don't fulfill the regular requirements, etc. And the third thing is lack of humility and focus. Again, here, this is that alignment's missing. Performing prayer without attentiveness or reflection on the meanings of what's being recited. And that's what we're looking at here in the context of this particular chapter. So the verse, فَوَيْلٌ لِلْمُصَلِّينَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنْ صَلَاتِهِمْ سَاهُونَ. This verse includes all forms of heedlessness. And anyone characterized by any one of them has a share in this warning. And if somebody embodies all of these shortcomings, their actions fully align with the traits of what's known as nifaq al-amali, which is outward hypocrisy or hypocrisy based on deed. Because that's one of the interpretations of this verse, is that it's addressing the hypocrites who, when it was time for prayer, were negligent. They were lazy, they let it go, they waited till the end. And when they did stand for prayer, they likely did it because somebody was watching them. All right? The next one, he says, وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ يَقْرَأُ بِلِسَانِهِ وَيُطَالِبُ قَلْبَهُ بِالْحُضُورِ مَعَ الْمَعَانِ وَهَذِهِ صَلَاةُ الْمُجَاهِدِينَ الْمُكَابِدِينَ. Then there are those who recite with their tongues while striving to bring their hearts to be present with the meanings. And this is the prayer of the enduring warriors. The Prophet ﷺ said, Al-Mujahidu man jahada nafsahu. Right? The true warrior is the one who strives against his own nafs. This is found in Sunnah Tirmidhi. And this is the type of jihad that we're after here. Right? If we look at, to understand a little bit about this, jihad al-nafs, struggling in particular in prayer to bring yourself back into alignment and balance. Ibn Rajab, he says that the second type of jihad is the struggle against the nafs in obeying Allah. The first type being jihad against your enemy. Okay? So here you're talking about struggling against the nafs to obey Allah. The Prophet ﷺ said the true warrior is the one who strives against his own nafs for the sake of Allah. One of the companions asked about engaging in battle, to which he replied, alayhi salatu wasalam, start with your own self, fight it first, and struggle against it first. The greatest form of striving against the nafs in obedience to Allah, Ibn Rajab, is maintaining the houses, his houses, the masajid, through remembrance and acts of devotion. And that's what we're talking about. This is what it's all about right now. He also said, this form of jihad requires patience. This is key here. Okay? The first bit there, Ibn Rajab, you find Lata'if al-Ma'arif. The second one is Jami' al-Ulum al-Hikam. He says that this form of jihad, jihad al-nafs, requires patience. Patience. Whoever patiently struggles against his own nafs, desires, and shaitan will overcome them, achieve victory, and gain mastery over himself, becoming noble and sovereign. They will be in charge of themselves, as opposed to being a subject, either to their own whims and desires or a subject to shaitan. However, whoever lacks patience, meaning they give up, I just can't do it. It's too hard. I'm done. They fail to struggle against their own selves. They will be overpowered, defeated, and taken captive, becoming a lowly servant to their own desires and to shaitan. So in this context here, we're talking about fighting, being an enduring here, warrior against your nafs, to stay attentive in prayer. That's the second category. The third one, he says, وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ يَقْرَأُ بِقَلْبِهِ فَيَكُونُ الْقَلْبُ هُوَ النَّاطِقُ بِالْقِرَاءَةِ وَيَكُونُ اللِّسَانُ مُتَرْجِمًا عَمَّا اسْتَكَنَّ فِي الْقَلْبِ فهذه صلاة المريدين الأوابين الذين اطمأنت نفوسهم وقلوبهم بذكر الله. So others recite with their hearts, such that the heart becomes the one articulating the recitation, while the tongue merely serves as an interpreter of what lies hidden within the heart. This is the prayer of the devoted, the penitent, whose souls and hearts find tranquility in the remembrance of Allah. الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَتَطْمَئِنُّ قُلُوبُهُمْ بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبُ, as Allah says in Surah Al-Ra'd, verse number 28. Those who believe and whose hearts find tranquility in the remembrance of Allah, unquestionably, by the remembrance of Allah, do the hearts find rest. Okay, that's number 3. The fourth one, and the pinnacle in prayer, he says, وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ إِذَا قَالَ اللَّهُ أَكْبَرُ غَابَ سِرُّهُ في مطالعة عظمة الكبرياء والتبسه جلاليب الجلال وأشرقت على سره شموس الجمال واكتنفته أنوار المعارف من جميع جهاته وقارب الجبار من قلبه ففني بالله وبقي به وصارت حركاته به ويبقى وجوده شبحا كالخيال والظلال في حضرة ذي الجلال واحتوشت قلبه نيران المحبة والوجدان واكتسبت نفسه المخافة والمهابة من حضرة الديان وامتحت الأكوان من سره لما باشر قلبه من أنوار الفردانية فمثل هذا إذا قرأ يعلم ما يقول ومع من يقول وهذه صلاة المقربين. So this is the last category. It says there are those who, when they say Allahu Akbar, their innermost self becomes absorbed in witnessing the majestic grandeur. They are cloaked in the garments of divine awe. Their innermost self is illuminated by the radiance of beauty and surrounded by the lights of gnosis from all directions. The omnipotent draws near to their hearts, and they become annihilated in Allah and remain sustained by Him. This is al-fana wal-baqa. Their movements become entirely by Him, and their very existence remains an apparition like a ghost or a shadow in the presence of the majestic. Their hearts are engulfed by the flames of love and ecstasy, their souls adorned with reverence and awe of Ad-Dayan, the one who judges all. The created universe vanishes from their innermost self as the lights of divine singularity come into contact with their hearts. Such a person, when reciting, is fully aware of what they are saying and with whom they are speaking. This is the prayer of those brought near to Allah. So the author is addressing the result of offering a prayer that is a spiritual event and not a ritualistic habit. And in this prayer, you become so engrossed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you forget everything else, all else, including yourself. And this is what the author, Imam al-Wasiti, is referring to as al-fana. He says, فَفَنِيَ بِاللَّهِ وَبَقِيَ بِهِ الْفَنَاء وَالْبَقَاء. So al-fana, as some of the greats have explained, the general meaning of fana, according to the Sufis, is that when the heart is absorbed in the divine truth, absorbed in al-haq, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that it becomes unaware of everything else. It said that fana is the state of being absent from all things. And it said that fana is to see nothing but Allah, to know nothing but Allah, and to be oblivious to oneself and all things besides Allah. We talked about that here. He even mentions this at the last moment of the last section. The created universe vanishes from their innermost self as the lights of divine singularity come in contact with the heart, such that you're no longer thinking of the world. You're no longer concerned with the material, not even your own self, but are absolutely fixated on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, such that there's nothing else of importance in that moment. And this is followed by baqa, fana being an annihilation, an eradication, an effacement, completely gone, vanished. He says, such that you're like an apparition. Your physical body, it's just like a ghost there, like a shadow there, meaning it's like you're not there anymore. And you can't stay in that state. It's certainly a lofty state from the various states and the maqamat, right, of the seeker. But you can't stay there forever because you have to be a part of this world. But you do need to reach that state to where you can see that there's nothing of importance or concern except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then there's baqa. He remains with Him. Baqa follows fana. And it's referred to the state where the seeker has given up everything that they do for themselves and now are in a state where they only do for Allah. And this is when prayer, when this happens, when this whole, as described by, I can't even describe it in such words. You can't even capture it in English, but I tried. This is when prayer becomes a joy. This is when prayer becomes the joy of your life. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, the coolness of my eye has been placed in prayer. Ju'ilat qurratu ayni bis-salah. Like the delight of my life has been made in prayer. Because what was described was the type of prayer the Prophet ﷺ prayed. Not stressed about the world, not thinking of the next thing to go do, the next meeting, the drive, the trip, the response, none of that. All gone. Nothing left but the divine. That divine light of Allah's magnificence and majesty engulfing your heart. Ibn Hajar, he says, when whoever finds the coolness of his eye in something desires never to part from it or leave it, for it is his entire delight, and through it his life is made pleasant. This is only attained by the worshipper through enduring hardship and perseverance in striving. And when the servant earnestly strives in full sincerity, Allah will reward them with such a prayer. This divine opening, this is considered a fath from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you would achieve such a prayer, must be appreciated, it must be protected. Otherwise, it would be spoiled and likely lost. As the Imam goes on and he says, وَمَنْ فَتَحَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ بِمِثْلِ هَذِهِ الصَّلَاةِ وَحَدَّثَتْهُ نَفْسُهُ بِأَنَّهُ قَدْ وَصَلَ وَصَارَ كَذَا وَكَذَا فَقَدْ دَخَلَ عَلَيْهِ الشَّيْطَانُ مِنْ حَيْثُ لَا يَشْعُرُ وَتَحَرَّكَتِ النَّفْسُ عَلَيْهِ مِنْ حَيْثُ لَا يَفْطُنُ وَذَلِكَ لِغَفْلَةِ عَنْ حُكْمِ الْمُرَاقَبَةِ الْبَاطِنَةِ. So whoever Allah grants by divine opening such a prayer, meaning the prayer that was just this last category of prayer, and then finds that his inner self, his nafs, whispers to him, basically saying that he has reached a certain station and status, Like, now you're at this level. Look at you go. In reality, he has been approached by shaitan without realizing it. And his nafs has been stirred without him being aware. And this occurs due to his heedlessness regarding the rule of inner vigilance, muraqabah. We go right back to that. All right, so muraqabah is a constant practice. The vigilance is a constant practice that has to be maintained. All right, so the passage here, the author is highlighting one critical aspect of spiritual discipline, and that is to be weary of the dangers of self-deception in worship. When a person experiences these divine openings, the futuhat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in their prayer, such that they have this heightened sense of presence and tranquility and humility and spiritual elevation, shaitan may attempt to corrupt all of that by instilling pride in them or self-satisfaction. They become like amazed, this ujub. They become like amazed with them. I'm astonished with myself. Look at me, I'm so special. I pray in such a majestic way. The nafs, it can be stirred very easily, leading a person to believe that they've attained a special status due to their own efforts. Bi'amali. We should be familiar with that. If you're going to enter into Jannah, you're going to do it by what? By your amal? Not by your own deeds. Bi rahmatillah. Okay? So you can never lose perspective there. So true vigilance or muraqabah demands constant control over one's inner state, ensuring that the sincerity that they have been blessed with and humility remain intact. This goes for all good deeds. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warns us in the Quran in multiple verses to be weary of self-delusion and righteousness. He says, فَلَا تُزَكُّوا أَنفُسَكُمْ هُوَ أَعْلَمُ بِمَنِ اتَّقَى. Do not claim purity for yourselves, like tazkiyat an-nafs. Don't claim purity for yourselves. He knows best who is truly righteous. Surah An-Najm, that's 53, verse number 32. He also says, بَلِ اللَّهُ يُزَكِّي مَنْ يَشَاءُ وَلَا يُظْلَمُونَ فَتِيلًا. He says here in this verse, Surah An-Nisa, verse number 49, rather Allah purifies whom He wills. Allah is the one that provides the tazkiyah. And injustice is not done to them even as much as a thread inside a date seed. So the seeker of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has to remain vigilant and must acknowledge that any goodness in his prayer is purely from Allah's grace and not his own merit. It's a principle you have to remember, that your output will never equate to Allah's outcome for you. There's nothing that you can do that balances the scale of what you get from Allah. It's just what you're doing is just it's shay' ramzi. Right? What's that? What is that? What you're doing, your amal is like, it's shay' ramzi. It's just like, I'm just going through the motions. I'm trying here because Allah is requested us, ordered us to act. But what He gives us, it's not like you're giving an exchange. It's not like you can afford what you get. Right? You can't afford what you're given by Allah. Doesn't matter how much you give, how much you do, what you get in return for that, it's not like a fair deal. There's no equivalent to it. Okay? So you have to remember that. You have to constantly be minimizing your own effort. Be minimizing and degrading yourself before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَمَنْ تَوَاضَعَ لِلَّهِ رَفَعَهُ اللَّهُ. Whoever humiliates themselves or humbles themselves for Allah, then Allah will raise them in degree. Okay, so he says, فَيَجِبُ عَلَى الطَّالِبِ إِتْقَانُ هَذَا الْبَابِ وَإِحْكَامُهُ كَيْ لَا يُفْسِدَ النَّفْسُ وَالشَّيْطَانِ أعماله وأحواله من حيث لا يشعر. بل من فتح الله عليه بمثل هذا الحال في الصلاة وغير الصلاة فليعرف عجز نفسه وقصورها وكونه لا يدري عواقبها ولا يدري ما يختم له ويذكر منة الله تعالى وفضله وكرمه فيفنى عن نفسه برؤية فضل الله وكرمه فيكون باقيا به فانيا عن نفسه وذلك يدرك بفضل الله ويداوم الاستعانة والاستغاثة وبدوام الاستعانة والاستغاثة وبالله المستعان ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. So here he says, thus the seeker must perfect and master this principle, what we just talked about, so that neither the nafs nor shaitan corrupt his deeds and spiritual states without his awareness. Rather, whoever Allah grants by divine opening such a state, whether in prayer or outside of it, should recognize the weakness and deficiency of their nafs, knowing that they do not control its outcomes, nor do they know how things will conclude. They should recall Allah's favor, grace, and generosity. Thereby their nafs is fully annihilated. Again, fana. This state of effacement, if you will. An annihilation due to what they witness of Allah's grace and generosity. And they remain baqa, yabqa. They stay with Him. This is realized solely by Allah's grace, through persistent seeking of His aid and reliance upon Him. And Allah alone is the one whose help is sought. And there is no power nor strength except with Allah al-Ali al-Azim. So here the author emphasizes the necessity of maintaining humility and reliance on Allah in your spiritual journey, in your spiritual growth. So the seeker has to master the principles of muraqabah. Right? It's no wonder that the Imam spent such a great deal of time talking about that. He spent a great deal of time spelling that out, and muhasabah and muraqabah and how those two work together and the intersection of them. And now we're looking at that with prayer and our other deeds. Right? The principle of muraqabah has to be mastered so that your deeds remain intact, free from corruption of the nafs or from shaitan. Without this vigilance, this muraqabah, one is likely to fall into self-admiration or heedlessness, assuming that the spiritual achievements are self-earned rather than divinely granted. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, emphasizing this point, it's already been mentioned, however, emphasizing it again, وَلَوْلَا فَضْلُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْكُمْ وَرَحْمَتُهُ مَا زَكَى مِنْكُم مِّنْ أَحَدٍ أَبَدًا وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ يُزَكِّي مَنْ يَشَاءُ وَاللَّهُ سَمِيعٌ عَلِيمٌ. Surah An-Nur, chapter 24, verse number 21. And if not for the favor of Allah upon you and His mercy, none of you would have been purified ever. But Allah purifies whom He wills, and Allah is as-Sami', He is Sami'un Alim. So the seeker here should reflect, as he points out, on their own deficiencies, and including the ignorance of their own fate. Like, you don't even know where you're going to end up. So you're not somebody special. You don't even have the knowledge of your own end or the end of your deeds. That doesn't mean you're complacent, but it means you're recognizing Allah's grace in your life. And this awareness will allow you to be annihilated, meaning your ego will be destroyed. And that will increase your dependence upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this states that he's mentioned here now twice, al-fana' wal-baqa'. It's not something that you achieve by personal effort alone. Of course, the effort is required. And it's, when I said before, it's shay ramzi, like it's just like something simple. It's not simple to you. Okay? Don't think, I'm going to do something simple to me. No, in comparison to what Allah gives you is simple, but for you it has to be a jihad. It has to be arduous, taxing, in order for you to reach spiritual elevation. And then, of course, what you do gets you a little bit, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings you the rest of the way. The seeker has to persist in seeking the divine. And with that, seeking His aid and acknowledging his own incapacity. True spiritual realization comes through Allah's assistance alone. وَمَا تَوْفِيقِي إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ تَوَكَّلْتُ وَإِلَيْهِ أُنِيبُ. As Allah says in Surah Hud, chapter 11, verse 88, and my success is only through Allah, upon him I have relied, and to him I turn in repentance. And then he ends this section, he says, وَكَذَلِكَ فِي الرُّكُوعِ وَالسُّجُودِ فَلْيُطَالِبْ قَلْبَهُ بِالْخُضُوءِ الْبَاطِنِ كَمَا قَدْ ظَهَرَ عَلَى ظَاهِرِهِ مِنَ الْخُضُوءِ الظَّاهِرِ ليتفق الظاهر والباطن ليتفق الظاهر والباطن فكثير ممن يخضع ببدنه في الركوع والسجود وقلبه غير خاشع ولا خاضع لله تعالى. So he says, likewise, in ruku', in bowing. So we just talking about prayer, reciting, really. Essentially, that's what we began with, Allahu Akbar, then starting to recite. He says the same thing applies to ruku', your bowing, and your sujood. One must call upon his heart to exhibit inner submission, just as his outward body demonstrates external submission. These positions that we're in prayer, they have meanings to them. When you're bowing, when you're prostrating, there's a meaning to these positions physically of submission and humility. And so the heart has to reflect that. He says this is so that the outward and inward states align. For many people outwardly humble themselves in bowing and prostration, while their hearts remain neither reverent nor truly submissive before Allah, exalted is He. Again, emphasizing the necessity of aligning the outward with the inward states of worship. And this ensures that the physical acts of submission, like ruku' and sujood, are accompanied by true humility. True humility and reverence and awe in your heart. True prayer is not just an act of the limbs, but a state of the heart. And that goes for the other acts of worship. In preparation for Ramadan, true fasting is not just abstaining from food and drink. Right? That's just the physical movement of it, or lack thereof. But it's about the fasting of the heart. Okay? And we'll talk about that in some detail as we get closer to the month of Ramadan. So here, bowing and prostrating, the ruku' and sujood, they symbolize the servant's surrender before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if the heart remains distracted or arrogant, the essence of submission is lost. And the Prophet ﷺ warned against this type of prayer. He says, رُبَّ صَائِمٍ لَيْسَ لَهُ مِنْ صِيَامِهِ إِلَّا الْجُوعِ وَرُبَّ قَائِمٍ لَيْسَ لَهُ مِنْ قِيَامِهِ إِلَّا السَّهَرِ. Says, perhaps a fasting person gains nothing from their fast but hunger, and perhaps a standing person gains nothing from their standing, meaning in prayer, but sleeplessness. This is found in Sunan ibn Majah. Right? So to ensure that the heart and the body are aligned, we have to cultivate humility and attentiveness in prayer and in the other various acts of worship. And this entails being fully present, aware of Allah's greatness, and allowing the physical motions of prayer to reflect the true submission within. And this is when you find success. As Allah says, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ فِي صَلَاتِهِمْ خَاشِعُونَ. Surah Al-Mu'minun. Successful indeed are the believers, those who have khushu' in their prayer. And that's where we'll wrap up for this evening. Jazakallah khair. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa akhiru da'wana. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.